What on earth is this?
This is Leipzig Halle Airport. It's a big old airport. Alright, see you next week. What do you mean the video can't be 1 minute long? Advertising? Okay, so this is indeed Leipzig Halle Airport in the German state of Saxony. It's a fairly standard dual runway airport out in the middle of nowhere, really. Considering the obscene amount of pristine flat wilderness surrounding the cities of Leipzig and Halle in all directions, the decision to build this airport quite so far out is, on paper at least, an odd one. But this airport was a rather unique experiment at the time, an attempt to build one airport to serve two major cities simultaneously. Both cities had seen a fair amount of early aviation in the previous decades, with hot air balloon landing sites and airfields dotted around the wider metropolitan area. But the growing volume of flights and the commercialization of air travel prompted the municipal government to consolidate these into one big airport to cover the whole region. Both cities initially protested the idea, but in the end it went ahead, and the airport was constructed in 1927 out here in, as I said, the middle of nowhere. But there was one big problem. To some people, this wasn't the middle of nowhere. This is Kursdorf. Kursdorf is a rather small village on the outskirts of Schkeuditz. Fun fact, Schkeuditz is home to the oldest motorway junction in Europe. I guess people were just trapped on the Autobahn indefinitely until that was built. It must have been a relief when it was finally finished. But yes, back to Kursdorf. The tiny village was, for literal centuries, rather idyllic, featuring a church and a schoolhouse and plenty of green space. The town was officially incorporated, as far as we can tell, in around the late 1400s, as these are the first recorded instances of the name Kursdorf being used. However, inscriptions on the church within the town appear to date back as far as 1310. So it's clear people had been living in this place for at least 600 years by the time it was chosen as the site of Leipzig Halle International Airport. As the local authority broke ground on this mammoth construction, the freewheeling Weimar Republic was in full swing and clearly hadn't developed a pervasive culture of NIMBYism just yet. So if you woke up one morning in your sleepy Saxon village to find that it had suddenly become a screaming inferno of propeller planes, you took it on the chin and went back to milking the cows or, I don't know, ringing church bells. I'm a city kid, I don't know what you country people are up to. By the time it was finished, the airport's one and only runway was only about 400 meters, or 1,300 feet, from the edge of Kursdorf, with one taxiway added in the decades following, a mere 55 meters from the edge of town, or about 180 feet, with 60,000 passengers per year using the airport by 1932. Needless to say, the constant sound of swarming propellers was presumably not one that the locals enjoyed, though archived records of public complaints from the Weimar and Nazi eras are shockingly hard to come by. How very un-German. And as if the poor residents of Kursdorf's luck couldn't have gotten any worse, the airport was targeted repeatedly by Allied bombing raids during World War II, with little Kursdorf directly in the line of fire, but somehow actually making it through the conflict mostly unscathed. The same cannot be said for the airport itself, which required rebuilding in order to serve as a state-run aircraft factory after the war, having fallen on the communist eastern side of Germany following its official division into East and West in 1949. However, there was another chapter to come in the tragedy of Kursdorf, the arrival of the jet age. Jet airliners became a common sight in civil aviation from around 1951 onwards in the US and Western Europe, and with the Eastern Bloc of communist countries desperate to keep up, enormously ambitious public works projects were undertaken, including turning Leipzig into a major aviation hub by rebuilding and expanding the existing runway, allowing for jets of all sizes to come and go at all hours of the night. This mammoth runway, finally finished in 1957, allowed the East German government to show off its shiny new aviation industry, while obviously upping the noise levels in Kursdorf to new, screeching heights. But despite having already paved the way for morphing East Germany into some sort of plain utopia, the GDR's government was nothing if not intimidatingly unpredictable, and so in 1961 it suddenly decided to terminate their entire aircraft manufacturing sector, sending Leipzig's aircraft throughput plummeting and giving the citizens of Kursdorf the occasional good night's sleep. But it wouldn't last long. Well, I mean, 1961 to 1972 is quite long, but yeah, basically in 1972, the airport was upgraded and given a more permanent foundation in order to usher in a new era of passenger travel in the Eastern Bloc using Soviet-built planes, with Leipzig handling year-round traffic for the first time since 1945. And by the 1980s, the airport was handling 550,000 passengers per year, and that's to say nothing of the freight flights that were also interspersed among the many commercial ones. By this point, it could be argued that the town was already beyond saving. Even by the mid-1960s, the village's population had begun its terminal decline, slowly dropping from its peak of 537 in 1950. Passenger traffic continued to rise throughout the 1980s, and by the time of German reunification in 1989, the village's population consisted of 271 stubborn Kursdorfians who refused to follow in the footsteps of their neighbours in becoming noise-based refugees. But there was yet another twist in the tale. For many in East Germany, the collapse of the East German government and the reunification was a breath of fresh air, with newfound social freedoms and a chance to reconnect with family and friends across the former border, along with an extreme economic crisis due to the implementation of capitalist shock therapy and the loss of thousands of jobs, but we'll ignore that bit for now. Unfortunately for Kursdorf's residents, the liberalisation of the economy meant a push for massively increased international trade and tourism across the following decade. And with Leipzig already boasting a robust passenger and cargo pedigree, money was pumped into the airport to the point where it needed yet another expansion. So what would the authorities do? Build another runway to the south? Upgrade the existing runway and introduce some lovely soundproofing for the residents? No, in 1997 they built an entire new runway to the north of the village, completely encircling it and trapping the entire town within the grounds of the airport. Now, the acoustic nuisance that Kursdorf had once suffered had become an omnidirectional sonic nightmare, like Dolby surround sound, but bad. And judging by the look of the municipality's official website, it looks like the town web designer may have been the first to pack his bags at this point. The airport gave lip service to the idea that it wouldn't further hamper life in Kursdorf, eventually building supposedly soundproof barriers which did absolutely nothing, as attested by the local residents and this outtake of me attempting to monologue. So it was the ambient noise that drove people away from this village. That's a plane taking off now, that's great timing. It is quite loud. Around this time, the steady decline of Kursdorf's population dramatically accelerated, and after the airport rubbed salt in the wound by expanding and upgrading the old southern runway in 2007, it would only be a few more years until the 600-year-old village of Kursdorf would officially become a ghost town. And now Kursdorf, a once unassuming village in the middle of the Saxony countryside, is basically dead. In the years since, media outlets have pounced on this unique story of urban encroachment into rural communities, dubbing it the loudest town in Germany, and it has become something of an oddity for travel nerds, hence me flying to Leipzig just to stand in this overgrown field looking like a dumbass. And after 700 years of this village being here, this is pretty much all that's left. The last residents left in 2017, and this church hasn't had a religious service since 2015. Kursdorf residents, in the final years before the last of them left, made it clear that they hold little ill will toward the airport. It had been there in one capacity or another for longer than any of them had been alive, and many of them even worked there. If this frankly superb 2010 Tagesspiel article by Kai Muller is any indication, it appears that the prevailing mood in the town was one of disappointment, rather than resentment, that Kursdorf and Leipzig couldn't coexist peacefully, though the debate over compensation for relocated residents was apparently rather fractious, and Kursdorf's Web 1.0 looking official website has some extremely harsh words for the owners of the airport. As of 2024, the church and a few farm buildings remain, but are unused, and plenty of other buildings have since been demolished to make way for a further airport expansion. In fact, most of the village was flattened in the end to make way for an enormous makeshift car park, which is very conveniently located for accessing the airport, but not conveniently located for your soul to access heaven as you park your Volkswagen Polo on the crumbling grave of a once thriving rural medieval community. Shame on you. This was once one of thousands of villages across Germany, harnessing the power of the fertile land around it to harbour life and sustain a community for centuries. But in hindsight, it feels as though once first ground was broken on Leipzig Airport 97 years ago, Kursdorf's fate was effectively sealed, and its demise was inevitable, no matter how much the residents fought it. And so, the story of Kursdorf has reached its conclusion, with a definitive line underneath it. But that doesn't mean that we can't continue to tell it.